Have you noticed that the road to prosperity isn't paved very well? Sometimes you run into potholes. Well, we'll talk about that a little bit later. But first, some interesting information. Did you know that Apple, the company or the stock, accounted for 23% of the gain in the S&P 500 during May? It also accounted for 35% of the gain in the Dow. Right behind Apple was Boeing, which accounted for 34% of the gain in the Dow. Concentration of a few stocks at these levels is dangerous. Keep your eye out. And there's also some interesting employment information. So let's take a look. Friday was all about the jobs report, and I'm sure you read it in the news. And in what was otherwise a solid jobs report, in which the establishment survey reported that a higher than expected 223,000 jobs were added, the biggest surprise was not in the establishment survey, but in the household survey, where the unemployment rate tumbled once more, sliding to a new 18-year low of 3.8%. And everybody was cheering this, including Wall Street. But what I'll bet you don't know, or most people don't know, and they're not paying attention to, is that the participation rate declined once again as a result of the stagnant labor force, which was virtually unchanged at just over 161 million persons in May. What was perhaps more interesting, however, is precisely the opposite is taking place, because in the month of May, the number of people not in the labor force increased by another 170,000 persons, rising to 95.9 million, a new all-time record high. That means, again, a record 95.9 million Americans are no longer in the labor force. Adding to this the 6.1 million currently unemployed Americans. So there are 102 million Americans who are either unemployed or out of the labor force. And it's also worth noting that of those employed, 26.9 million are part-time workers. So I'm sorry to be a contrarian, but I like to look at both sides of the equation. Remember, you have buyers and sellers in the market, and someone always knows something. And also remember, what they don't say can be equally or more important than what they do say. So let's go to the charts. Today we're going to look at several charts, beginning here with the 6-month daily on the spiders. I'm not going to go to the monthly because not much has changed. However, as you know, the monthly cycle always has the most power and takes precedence over the shorter cycles. And then, of course, the weekly takes precedence over the daily, and the daily over the intraday or the hourly in that fashion. But what happens is the power or the movement of the cycle, you have to have a transfer from, say, the daily to the weekly or the weekly to the monthly. And right now, we're a little bit muddled in the power transfer from the daily to the weekly. And you can see that here in the price chart. You see that it's bouncing between, say, 270 and 275 on the upside in a sideways fashion, just kind of meandering. So there's no real transfer as, say, beginning here, we clearly went down, and here we clearly went up and then down. But here in this area in April, May, and then now, we're having a time or a difficult time of transferring that power. It's a bit muddled, and it happens around this midline here. So you can see in this time frame here, and also right here. It looks to me that the fast line is below and wants to maybe go back up above again here after just a short period of time, and that may well happen next week. We'll have to wait and see. But here in the histogram, you can also see that the power transfer is not real clean. We'll get to the weekly and I'll show you where it occurs there as well. And into the relative strength also hovering around the midline. Looks like it wants to go up. The stochastic kind of wants to go up, but it hasn't crossed through this the slow line either. The volume is moderate, And then the Williams clearly wants to head on up. Back up to the price chart though, again, you can kind of see the sideways movement is sort of directionless. There's nobody that's really taking control, the buyers or the sellers. Let me go to the weekly chart and further explain. Okay, the 2-year weekly chart on the spiders. And here you can see a little bit of the muddling in this area here, which is in the April, May, and certainly here in May, and now today being June 1st. You got an upward direction, but certainly in this time frame here, you're pretty much going sideways. And then again, it happens when you have this transfer. We're near the zero line. We're heading on up, but we're not. The fast line's not through the slow line yet. It kind of wants to go, but it's hesitating. And then you see here in the histogram again, we're near zero, as well as in the price rate of change. We're hovering around zero. Once we're going up, and then now we're heading down. So not quite making a clear decision on which way to go. Relative strength looks like it wants to go through here, but it's still near the midline, so a little bit indecisive. Stochastic, that kind of wants to head up, but it's just barely above the 50 or the midline there as well. And the volume will move through that into the Williams. Again, the Williams, like in the daily, the Williams is saying, hey, let's go, let's run. But the power transfer hasn't occurred. But as we can see, at least through here in the MAC slow line or fast line wants to move up through that slow line. So once we are successfully moving through that slow line and we start heading up here, only then can we convincingly start moving up in the price chart. So my expectation is for things to move up, but it's going to take another week or so before we really start gaining some steam. But let's go and take a look at the NASDAQ, and I'll show you something else. We're looking at the 2-year weekly chart on the triple Qs or the cube, which serves more or less as a proxy for the NASDAQ. And the NASDAQ is a little bit more powerful in that it created a higher high here in early May. Both the Dow and the S&P had their peak in late January, did not revisit, whereas again the NASDAQ did create a newer high here in early March. Now it's also more powerful as indicated in the last few weeks here in May, as we can see that it's starting to head on up and it's actually relatively near a new high. So certainly this has a lot more strength, and I think this is going to pull up the S&P and the Dow and all the rest of the stocks. And we can see that here in the MACD, where the fast line is up through the slow line, heading on up just barely, but certainly it's through. So it's ahead of the S&P and the Dow, and that's also why I expect the S&P to ultimately start heading higher. And then here in the histogram, we could see that it just popped above the zero line there. In the price rate of change, it is heading on up, just down here recently, but that is not all that consequential. The relative strength, certainly compared to the S&P, is doing better, heading on up. And you see that as well in the stochastics, definitely stronger. Started out just barely below the 50 line and headed on up. So certainly more strength to that. Again, that's going to pull up the S&P and the Dow. And again here, the Williams definitely heading on the way up and trying to pull everybody else up with it. So back here to the price chart, I think that at least as the triple Qs go, we're possibly going to have a new high here relatively soon. And again, I think that's going to pull the Dow up as well as the S&P 500. So into next week, it may be a little bit of struggle for that power shift from the daily to the weekly, but ultimately, I think that all the indices are going to be heading on up. So look forward to that in the next week or two. And for today, that's ChewDog Charts. Thank you.